Hello and welcome to a new video by the Beatdown Masters. We have a very interesting recording of a competitive cEDH game for you today. So let's get to the introduction of our spellslingers. First, we have Luke, who plays with Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. This proactive deck tries to utilize Selvalla's ability, generating a huge amount of mana and then playing into big spells that take out the opponents. Luke's opening hand contains a forest, a Kenriff's transformation, an Elvish mystic, a mana crypt, a nature's claim, a priest of Titania and a haunted troll. Second, we have Knots, who plays the Gitrog monster. Also a very proactive deck, it tries to take advantage of the Gitrog monster's ability and the Dredge ability to manipulate the library in order to generate infinite mana and then wipe out the board. Knots had to mulligan down to 6 and his opening hand contains a Nature's Claim, a Sylvan Scrying, a Lotus Petal, an Emergence Zone, a Mana Crypt and a Llanowar Elves. Third in row we have Matt, piloting Elsha of the Infinite. This adaptive deck tries to assemble a combo with Sensei's Divining Top and the Cost Reducer to draw its entire library and eventually storm off. The deck also has a lot of interaction built in it to disrupt other players in the early game. Matt's opening hand contains 2 planes, a mountain, a Chrome Mox, a Mox Diamond, an Opt and a Baral, Chief of Compliance. Last but not least we have Dario, who plays with Zur the Enchanter. This highly disruptive build tries to slow down its opponent with stacks pieces and interfering in their combos. After assembling its own combos in the late game, it wins with, for example, a Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation combo. Dario starts with a Forbidden Orchard, a Mystic Gate, a Glacial Fortress, a Flooded Strand, a Lightning Greaves, and a Grand Abolisher and a Pact of Negation. With the introductions made, let's get to the game. Luke won the dice roll and starts the game. He draws and plays a forest. He then plays a Mana Crypt and generates 3 mana to cast a Priest of Titania. He then passes the turn. Knots draws and then brings an Emergence Zone into play. He follows up by playing his own Mana Crypt and a Lotus Petal after that. He sacks a Lotus Petal to generate 1 green mana to play a Llanowar Elves. He then passes. Matt starts his turn, draws and brings a Plains into play. He then casts a Mox Diamond and discards a Plains to it. After that, he casts a Chrome Mox and imprints an Opt. He then generates 2 mana to cast a Baral, Chief of Compliance. After that, he gives the turn to Dario. Dario draws, and ashamed of himself, he plays a Glacial Fortress, which enters the battlefield tapped. After this very explosive first turn cycle, with one little exception, the turn shifts to Luke. Luke begins his second turn and, in his upkeep, wins the Mana Crypt trigger, taking no damage. He then draws and casts an Elvish Mystic. After that, he taps the Priest of Titania for a total of 3 green mana because there are 3 elves in play. In addition, he taps the Mana Crypt, generating another 2 colorless mana. With 2 green mana and 1 colorless, he casts his commander Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, which resolves. With the last green mana in his pool, he plays a Boreal Druid. After that, he brings a Command Beacon into play as his land for the turn, and with nothing else to do, he gives the turn to Knots. In Knots' upkeep, he loses the Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws. He taps the Llanowar Elves for 1 green mana and casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. With no other options available and missing a land drop, he gives the turn to Matt. Matt untaps and draws. He brings a Training Center onto the battlefield as his land for the turn. He then casts a Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, which especially annoys Dario, who has not yet have had the opportunity to play a spell at all. Matt then gives the turn to Dario. He untaps, draws, and brings a Mystic Gate onto play. Being braked harshly by the Grand Arbiter, he gives the turn to Luke. Luke untaps and loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then plays a Summoner's Pact, paying 1 additional mana because of Augustine. The spell resolves and he searches his library for a haunted troll and puts that creature into his hand. He then taps his Priest of Titania and generates 6 green mana. With 2 of them and 2 colorless from the mana crypt, he casts the haunted troll, paying 1 more due to the Grand Arbiter's tax. The spell resolves and on its ETB Luke gives 4 1/1 fairy tokens to Dario. With the remaining 4 mana from his pool and by tapping his Boreal Druid and the forest, he casts a Soul's Majesty targeting the haunted troll again, paying 1 more because of Augustine. The spell resolves too and he draws 8 cards. He then plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx as his land for the turn. After that he activates Selvala's ability, adding 8 mana in his mana pool. For 2 mana he casts a Wild Growth and enchants one of his forests. For 4 mana he casts a Relic Golem, and for 3 more mana he casts Lignify targeting the Grand Arbiter. With apparently no more fuel in his hand, he gives the turn to Knots. He untaps and loses the Mana Crypt trigger again, taking 3 lives, and he asks himself why he had played it turn 1 and not used it yet. He then draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. After that he casts his commander, the Gitrog monster, and loses 1 life because of the Elves of Deep Shadow. The spell resolves and he sacks his Verdant Catacombs, losing 1 life. The land entering the graveyard triggers the Gitrog monster and he draws a card. He then searches his library for a Bayou and brings it into play. After that he gives the turn to Matt. Matt untaps and draws. He plays a mountain as his land for the turn. He then pays 5 mana to cast his commander Elsha of the Infinite. After looking at his top card of the library, he passes the turn to Dario. Dario draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He immediately sacks the Flooded Strand, paying 1 life, and brings a Watery Grave onto the battlefield. He shocks himself, so it enters untapped. He then pays 2 mana to play a Dronith Magistrate, which comes a few turns too late. He then gives the turn to Luke. Luke untaps and in his upkeep wins the Mana Crypt trigger. He then draws. He activates his Nykthos Shrine to Nyx by tapping the Mana Crypt and generates 7 mana. For 1 mana he casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. For 2 more mana he plays a Kenrith's transformation which can't be countered and targets the Gitrog monster with it. On its ETB he draws a card. He then activates Selvala's ability for 1 mana and generates 8 more mana because of the Haunted Troll and has now a total of 11 mana in his pool. For 3 mana he casts a Reclamation Sage and targets the Mana Crypt from Knots. He then activates the ability of the Relic Golem for 2 mana and has Mad Mill 2 cards. With the remaining 6 mana in his pool, he activates the ability of the Allosaurus Shepherd. All of his elf creatures have now base power and toughness of 5/5 and are dinosaurs in addition to their other creature types. He then moves to his combat phase. He declares the Haunted Troll, the Elvish Mystic and the Boreal Druid as attackers at Knots. Knots takes a total of 18 damage. With nothing else he can do, he sadly gives the turn to Knots. Knots untaps and draws. He taps the Llanowar Elves to cast a Nature's Claim targeting the Kenrich's transformation. The spell resolves, the enchantment is destroyed and Luke gains 4 lives. He then casts a Sylvan Scrying and searches his library for a Gaia's Cradle and puts it into his hand. After that he plays the Gaia's Cradle as his first land for the turn. He then taps the Cradle for 3 green mana. With 1 of those mana he activates the Emergence Zone and sacrifices it. Until end of turn he can play spells as though they had flash. The Gitrog monster triggers and he draws a card. He then plays a Cabal Pit as his second land for the turn. He taps the Cabal Pit for a black mana, takes 1 damage and uses another mana from his pool to cast a Demonic Tutor. The spell resolves and he searches his library for the last missing combo piece and puts it into his hand. For another 2 mana he casts an Oblivion Crown, targeting the Llanowar Elves. He then activates this ability and discards a Dagmor Salvage. The ability resolves and the Gitrog monster triggers. With this draw trigger on the stack, Luke responds by casting a Nature's Claim, targeting the Oblivion Crown. In response to that, Knots activates the ability once again and discards a Dryad Arbor. The discard of this land triggers the Gitrog monster again, and the draw trigger goes on the stack. He activates the Dredge ability from the Deckmore Salvage, mills 2, and puts the Deckmore Salvage back into his hand. He gets another draw trigger because of the Ancient Tomb, which hits the graveyard. Before the Nature's Claim would resolve, Knots activates the Oblivion Crown ability again and discards the Deckmore Salvage, which triggers the Gitrog monster, and he decides to dredge again. With this loop and every land card he mills, he generates enough draw triggers to draw his entire library and manipulating it in a way so at the end it contains only a land and, for example, a Kozilek Butcher of Truth. With this state, Knots gets infinite mana with, for example, a Lotus Petal, and then casts an outlet spell as, for example, Ebony Charm, defeating every opponent. This combo is very complicated to explain, and we left you a link to a very good article by Leptys on Tapped Out. So Gitrog took the win today. We hope you very much enjoyed this video from us. Stay tuned for more. Please like and share the channel so we can further grow. And until next time, have a good one.